Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Crown Zenith, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be looking at the Taiwan Regional League Top 16 decks. So this is the third post-rotation tournament that we're going to have a look at, so I am going to be giving a summary towards the end of the results of all three combined. That's going to be this tournament as well as Bangkok's results and Aichi results, so plenty to discuss. Let's get into the deck lists, and it was once again Lost Zone Box coming out on top. It's won all three of the tournaments we've had so far in the post-rotation format. This one is a bit of a turbo-based build where we're seeing Forest Sealstone as well as a high Lost Vacuum count, which I think is pretty interesting. One of the only ways we can get to 7 ASAP is using these sorts of cards as well as many switch cards as we possibly can. So we can try and really tempo out in the opening stages. Even if we've gone second, if we can reach that 7 threshold, we can be gating Greninja to be very disruptive to anyone that hasn't developed Manaphy, or promoting big threats like Raikou and Dragonite, which I think are both pretty solid cards right now. Raikou can still hit a pretty relevant weakness, as we'll see. Lugia is doing quite well so far, so definitely feels reasonable there. And Dragonite is just more stable damage output, which is pretty solid for a two-prize Pokemon that we can ramp this quickly. You can obviously get knockouts on evolving V Pokemon if they happen to be in the active, so you have that really good tempo play you can look for. You obviously have Cram to fall back on as well, so a lot of diverse options. A lot of the spaces have been committed towards these sorts of speedy cards. We have to resort to Recycler now to make the gates work freely. And we just have the Drapion, of course, to help out against the Mew players. Interestingly enough, Luminion's something that we haven't seen too much of. I think most of the time we've seen Pokegear, and I do feel like the card's slightly strange in the deck list because you are so tight on bench space, especially with the list so focused on getting to 7 in the zone as quickly as possible. I would have thought that your bench space is mostly just Comfey all over the place, and then Greninja takes up a bench spot, oftentimes Manaphy's there as well. So I'm not the biggest fan of Luminion, but obviously it's a guaranteed supporter rather than a lucky dip with gears. Just a small thing there. The other real notable take from the whole tournament, actually, was Collapsed Stadium in Lost Zone Box. I'd have thought this is a bit of a counterintuitive card. We actually see, Collapsed in the likes of Lugia and Arceus builds to remove some of their damaged Pokemon as a counter to Lost Box, but actually being played in this 60, maybe it's just in case you start any of these guys, or if you put them down in the early stages in like mirror match situations, they can sponge and you can collapse away your 2 prizes, which I feel like could be pretty interesting. But it's shown up in a number of the deck lists, and I can't really put my finger on as to why. Possibly it's even a card that you can proactively play before you start doing your Lost Mine shenanigans, so people can't collapse Stadium to heal on the turn that you do this play. It feels kind of niche to me though, but it seems to be popping up in a number of the deck lists, as we'll see now. The second place list was also Lost Zone Box, but quite a different build. It seems like that's the big divide right now. There's going to be Sky Sealstone base builds, which get to 7 that little bit slower, because they don't play the vacuums either in this case, so you're a little bit more content using Cram in the opening stages, but you mostly use the Sky Sealstone for a crucial turn to uptrade, with weakness with Drapion, or again, Galarian Zapdos coming into the deck list to hit another weakness up against Arceus players or Miraidon players, which seems pretty relevant in fairness. Surprisingly, this one's not playing a Raikou V, but it is actually playing a different tech card for, I presume, Lugia, and that's the Cry of Destruction Yveltal. The path in that matchup then becomes use your Greninja and Sableye to deal with both of their Archeops, and then you try and destruct away all their energies and just sort of run them out. I feel like this is a slightly worrying approach when Radiant Serena is so popular in the Lugia players' deck lists, where they can offset the math between Greninja and Sableye. But maybe this is a card you can try and spam, even if the opponent can get an early response with enough energy that they've just sort of stockpiled whilst you get to that board state. Because, of course, we have Clara plays alongside Gate, or if we just have the physical copy, we can Raihan into the Yveltal. So it gives you an interesting dynamic against the Lugia players for certain. This also plays second Manaphy and Roxanne, so certainly respecting the mirror. It feels like management of Manaphy is a really big way that a player can end up winning or losing the game, essentially, if they can or can't recover it, as it gets constantly targeted by Lost Mine players, etc., because the Greninja double snipe play is always so deadly. So having that peace of mind of just seeing it in the early stages and not committing to a Clara play the turn a mana fee's knocked out is always quite nice. And yeah, the Roxanne can make it harder for the opponent to Clara back their mana fee on the turn, and if that doesn't happen, you can take advantage with your own Greninja, which I think is a really solid play. Essentially, from the first place list, this is just playing a lot more supporters. It's playing double Raihan, and we didn't see any in the previous list. So it's kind of like item tempo versus just stability with supporters throughout the game. This one, notably, is also playing Luminion. In top 4, we see another Skyseal Stone-based build. This is kind of more traditional, I suppose, where it has the 3 flavors, which I feel like are kind of the most mandatory includes of any of the Vs. I feel like Zapdos is take your pick whether or not you respect Arc and Miraidon players. As we'll see later on, Miraidon hasn't done too well in these larger scale tournaments just yet, but it could still be a big threat, and if you respect Arceus, which has been doing quite well, it's still going to be a decent include. This doesn't really have any mid-range attacker, and interestingly enough, it's quite low on the gate counts, just 3 gate. Still plays the double Recycler, but it feels like with the double Raihan already in the deck list, you can support your 2 main V Pokemon. The gate is kind of supplementary, and so that you can threaten your Greninja in like mirror match situations. It's kind of the main reason why I see it doing well. The Roxanne once again is showing up in this build. Strangely, it's a specking a switch instead of playing 4 rope, just a tiny thing there. And once again, we're seeing Collapsed over and over again, doing quite well in some of these lists. There's also a top 16 60, which is going back to Turbo Forest Stone approach. Nothing too spicy in this list. It feels like more of the same, just juggling around a few counts that we haven't really discussed. Adding in an Ultra Ball is kind of interesting to incorporate your Luminion that little bit more, to be an additional out. Again, I feel like, especially if you have 2 spots dedicated to this, I think 2 gears is just so much better at this stage, but there we are. And then we have another top 16 list. This is also Forest Seal Stone based, but it's playing Quad Trekking Shoes. It is making some questionable cuts though. It's not playing Drapion, which I think is super sus. And what else have we got going on in here? Not playing the Roxanne or Raihan. Also kind of interesting. But this is, again, the turbo-based build. So the turbo build often doesn't play the Raihan, in fairness. But Trekking Shoe is just trying to help you get to that God mode of 7 as quickly as possible, which definitely makes sense. We move on to Gardevoir. So it was 3 of the top 4 decks were Lost Zone box. The other deck that did make just top 4 was Gardy. And this is actually just a copy-paste of the second-placed Aichi list. So it feels like this list itself has already accumulated a lot of points for the Gardevoir players. I always look at this list on paper and feel like it's a little bit sus with its supporter draw options, but it seems to be getting the job done over and over again, so fair play to this Gardy list. For top 8, however, it was a Lugia fest, so we have a lot of Lugias to look at now as well. Definitely the single strike package is the way to go as far as things look. We have a 1 prize Yveltal and Stonjourner. These both are nice 130 hit point chunky single prizes, which are nice against Lost Box. And obviously continue to hit decent weaknesses. We've got the Pump, we've got the Serena to help out. Like I said, it can offset specifically Greninja Sableye math into your Archeops. I think that's the key purpose for the Radiant Serena. And I suppose it can also be used as a rope block option as well if it's just on the board, because you can always pay retreat out with DTE with this sort of card, so that's always nice. We have an Impact Energy as well as 3 Urns, so really not trying to get mugged off by missing on your single strike energy attackers, which is pretty important. This list is very cheeky on support accounts, only playing the 4 Research, the 1 Judge, not playing any Serena, not playing... Well, yeah, just 1 Judge is really, really low. So it looks like a lot of their space has been dedicated to a really high stadium count. 5 physical stadiums plus Pump is a lot, right? Mesagoza is really, really popular right now, and Double Collapsed is giving you a lot of ways to remove damaged Lugias against Lost Box players. It feels a little bit overkill, but I feel like 1 copy is going to be pretty much staple in Lugia going into EUIC. We have another top 8 list. A few different changes here. You can see a lot more diversity in the supporter pool this time around, where we've got Sharon's Care, the 1 Serena, the extra Judge, the Zinnia's Resolve coming in, which I think is kind of nice as well. If it's a similar niche to Burnett, where it means you don't have to just dump your hand with Research, you can just cherry pick some Archeops to the bin, which is really nice. This one's not playing Pumpkaboo, which is a little bit sus, and it only plays 4 bounces, so that would be definitely something that I look at. The other key differential is that it plays Regenerative Energy rather than Lucky. Definitely some upsides to Regenerative, where this has a lot of healing against Lost Box, right? 2 copies of this, plus Sharon's Care, plus Collapsed, and just having general, 3 single prize Pokemon which are bulky. This gives you a lot of ways to target Lost Zone box, so I definitely feel like there's a lot of respect being given there with this 60. Have another top 8 list. This one's going back to the Pumpkin, just playing the 1 Stonjourner, and it feels like we're going between 1 and 2 copies between these lists. This honestly just feels like the vanilla down the line 60. So if you are just sort of looking at trying to pick up a very simplistic Lugia, this would be the one I would divert people to. I feel like the second Judge is pretty staple though. Maybe eating into your urn count or your nest ball count would be my choice. If you just want to put in a second Judge there, you've got a really good like vanilla 60. Maybe flip-flop a Collapsed with a third Mezagoza. Those would be my sort of instant recommendations, but it feels like a very solid starting point list here for sure. Then in this top 16, I see Drapion, and it makes no sense compared to all the other lists that we've seen with the Yveltal being an extra attacker against Lost Box, and you know, because you're already weak to Path and Roxanne from the Mew players, having Yveltal is just an easier way of attacking them. So I feel like the Drapion's definitely outclassed in that regard. Outside of that, back to Lucky Energy, just a small thing there. Very high on the DTE count, which is kind of interesting. Gives you a fallback, I suppose, if you have whiffed your VSTAR power, if you've attached turn 1 and 2, but that's still a bit of a high roll. Roxanne's also an interesting one. Obviously very powerful, but one that you have to sort of lie in wait to try and spring the trap on people with. But I suppose people won't expect it too often in Lugia, so that's kind of cool. We move on to Mew, which did claim a top 8 spot, and it's playing a Flying Pikachu package, which we have seen before with Mahone and his testing group. There's a couple choices that I really dislike about this list, to be honest with you. Only 2 VMAX when you don't play Silene is like so punishing sometimes. I feel like that would just be so rough, and that really makes me panic a little bit. Outside of that, not too bad, honestly. I really like that Featherball gives you a lot of targets, which is actually a really high value one-of in the deck list. Crystal Cave kind of interesting as well. I imagine you're trying to max balloon against them, so Cave trying to stop their like Genesect sprinkles is somewhat reasonable. I've seen a lot of Japanese lists not playing Lost City, but honestly I feel like it's a staple in Mew going forward because there's so many Lost Zone players that play Drapion, and of course they have Clara in their deck list, so it is still vital to Lost City away their Drapions going into that going into EUIC. Shoes are also something you don't often see in many Mew, but I'm not necessarily opposed to them in the deck list just for extra consistency. But I feel like, especially if you're only playing 2 VMAX, a Silene is like essential in this deck list. There's no way of getting around that, I don't think. On to Arctina, which also did pretty well. 3 in top 16, I think. And I believe they all were playing Flying Pikachu as well, giving yourself that sort of defensive dimension, which I think is kind of nice when you're already like planning to spam Judge very often with your tanky 2 prizes. It definitely is a reasonable choice. Obviously, we have to be slightly concerned about Galarian Zapdos making it into a number of Lost Boxes, so that's a new development that Arceus might be challenged by, but you're still trying to make some chunky stuff happen for you. I thought it was really cool that this deck tries to steal a space by playing the 1-2 Barrel line, because you're already playing Hisuian, and obviously you only try and get 1 Barrel out in almost every game anyway, so that was a kind of cool space shoot that I thought, so you don't get clogged up with your incisors the whole game. A little bit cheeky. But yeah, this also seems like a really good baseline for the list. Double Belt maybe slightly higher, but yeah, overall looking pretty good. The second list is a lot thicker on Pokemon, so compromising quite a lot with supporters, which makes me worry a little bit. This isn't playing any Serena, so 2 Boss is the only Gust this list has, which is very sus. And it's quite low on draw supporters as well. But yeah, it means it gets to play double Flying Peak and double, 2-2 per barrel, which is kind of more standard, I would say. But yeah, a couple of big compromises in this list. Only 1 Belt, only 1 Path as well feels quite low to me. And then the final list is incorporating some different supporters, back to that healthier supporter count, also adding in a Colrus into the list. But obviously back to the thinner line of Barrel and Pikachu now. So we've seen, basically these are the lines that people are tampering with. How thick you want the Barrel and how thick you want the Flying Pikachu. That's what the spaces that basically all these lists have stolen. But other than that, everything else seems to be sort of well set. And then there was 1 Giratina VSTAR actually in top 16. Playing some really interesting counts. I actually really dislike this list because it plays 2 VIP Pass and only 3 Comfey, and that's probably sinful, I think, at that stage, because you're aggressively not wanting to set up with these counts. It's so greedy, I feel. There's also some really interesting inclusions. Tropius is a grass type rally back, so like revenge attacker that you can hit into Tyranitar V with, so you can one-hit KO them with a Mirage Gate as a one-prize up trader. It's obviously not worth the space when you're cutting such important cards, but it could be a card to bear in mind for certain Lost Zone boxes. It's got Forest Sealstone in here as well, which I think is also kind of sus, because in most situations you want to get a Giratina VSTAR developed, obviously. And then in situations where you would think that VSTAR power is not very good, like against Lost Zone box, putting down your 2 prizes is also like really, really bad for you. So I don't feel like you get many activations of Forest Sealstone. So also very sus there. The Choice Belt is kind of niche, but I feel like we've just seen a lot of Arceus with Gardy, so I think that's actually a reasonable choice right now. Although you can try and just set up Sableye throughout the game on those sorts of cards. So yeah, a very greedy Tina. But it's one of the only ones that's made it into top 16, so what do I know? We also have the very spicy Palkia Ice Rider making it into top 16, with also some very interesting counts. Now, I was stunned when I first saw this list, because it's not playing Irida, and I would have thought when we have such a lot of item cards leaving our format that can search Pokemon, Irida would be like a shining light and a big selling point of playing a water deck, but it seems like Arven has taken over the Irida slot in some regards here, where you have the double belt and the Sky Seal Stone. But we've actually seen Palkia Ice Rider before, like at Worlds, for example, where Bibarel was sort of helping out, and you also had Greninja draws, so there are still some strengths here, and you can still hit some pretty reasonable numbers. Sky Seal Stone, I think, is mostly just for Drapion, more often than not, because in other situations you'll almost definitely Star Portal, so definitely a niche combo. But I feel like the Arven supports it fairly well, at the very least. Temple of Sinnoh, also a very strong card for Lugia. So you have some disruptive plays with Empoleon and Klefki against Mew and against Lost Box to try and slow them down. You have Temple to help out against Lugia, so something cooking here for sure, where you're trying to be like, well, I'm at least getting into the game with my engine and a ton of trekking shoes and all that other stuff, and Greninja spamming Water Energy to the discard pile, and you're trying to throw in a little handful of disruption and have different prize maps. I feel like Palkia is probably going to remain like lower tier, but the fact that this list has worked with quite an unorthodox like supporter line and such gives me hope that it could still be powerful. And as promised, we have a summary of the 3 events that we've had so far. Now, I've given essentially these placements the same as a regional CP would be, giving us a little fake CP statistic going into the EUIC to try and give a picture of how successful decks have been so far. Take this with a grain of salt. Obviously, all the tournaments weren't on the same dates. I believe Aichi was first and the other 2 were on the same weekend, so maybe some knee-jerk reaction to Aichi in terms of like net decking and just choosing different archetypes based on their success at the previous tournament, obviously. But it looks like Lost Zone Box is way out in front as the strongest archetype, really earning far more placements and going deepest into the tournaments as well. Is an obvious sign that this is the strongest deck in the game right now. And then we go down the list with Lugia still remaining a very strong force, it seems. Hasn't gone that deep into the tournaments in terms of through Top Cut, but it's finding a way to successfully still win a lot of games. Obviously has some big type coverages at its disposal. Still has some of the most insane energy acceleration available, and can be quite one pricey as well, which is really important to keep up with Lost Zone Box, where your 1 prizes are kind of chunkier than Lost Zone's 1 prizes. And from what we've looked at today, most of the Lost Zone decks are like very 1 pricey, but they don't have like that mid-range attacker. They don't have like the Snorlax or the Zamazenta. Only one of the lists from, I believe it was, the Thailand winning list was a Zamazenta Lost Box. But some of the other Lost Zone boxes that we've looked at, mostly today, have been just Cram, just Sableye, and then like a variety of 2 prizes. So something to bear in mind there, and part of the reason why I think Lugia is keeping up is that all of its 1 prizes are chunky and can sort of buy turns back against Lost Zone, which is really important. Guardy's done pretty well. It seems to have hit the ground running. And interestingly enough, just people taking the Aichi list have all seen like relatively good success, so that's pretty good. Arctina, kind of the standout surprise. Again, not going too deep into tournaments, 1 second place finish is very solid. And it just seems to be that keeping people honest pace setter, where it has Judge, it has Path at its disposal, and it's just trying to, do its good old-fashioned game plan and tempo out on people whilst disrupting. Mew's still managing to do well, but not quite reaching those higher tiers because, well, Lost Box is all playing... Well, a lot of them are playing Sky Seal Stone Drapion. That obviously hurts you quite a lot. And being slightly unfavoured into Lost Zone Box is not a great feeling going into EUIC, because I imagine it's going to be popular with this amount of backing from previous tournaments. Lost Zone Tina, similar situation where I feel like it's just weak into the Lost Zone mirror, the sort of one prizier mirror that has like more Clara at its disposal and such. I think the only real thing you have is Roxanne to stabilize, and I feel like that's kind of copium. So I feel Tina, it's a hard choice for the tournament, but if people are trying to target Lost Zone Box in that it's a low damage output deck and start to bring tanking archetypes, like more Arceus starts seeing play, maybe Goodra starts seeing some play, that's when Giratina like shines. So I feel like a successful Tina wouldn't surprise me too much, but it has to try and navigate that Lost Zone Box, maybe with Roxanne, maybe with its own Horlucha, maybe going thin on Giratina, just playing like a 2-2 at most, and then still having Snorlax and like Clara and such, so you can bring back your Sableye just as much as them in Mirror, and just go pound for pound with them, essentially, I think could be a decent option. There was an Arc Gallade, which is the spiritual successor to Arc Intel. Kind of a wacky deck, but cool to see. Speaking of wacky, Dialga Magnezone has got one top 16 placement so far, the 22 energy deck. And we've also seen the Palkia Ice Rider today so far. So notable things that aren't on the list. Miraidon Regieleki was very popular in Aichi and has had a lot of lower... What am I trying to say? Lower person tournament results. There's got to be a better way of constructing that sentence. But in smaller events, it's done quite well. In Japan, in their essentially League Cup style events, it's done pretty well. And it seems to still be quite consistent. I feel like it struggles against Lugia just because of Stonjourner. And I feel like it's also can be rough into Lost Zone Box if people are playing the Zapdos. So it's not too crazy to think that Miraidon won't be super popular. But I also feel like people will gravitate to that sort of deck because it has a very simple game plan and gets into the game in a lot of situations, which is quite appealing. I would also say that like Goodra as a Lost Zone deck has done very well in Western events, so I wouldn't be too surprised if it made a mini comeback, because I also feel that can do quite well into Lost Zone Box, where you're trying to capitalize on the low damage output of the archetype. It has inbuilt healing and still has that Lost Zone engine to fall back on, where Greninja can be a threat, and it still has its Cram and all that other stuff. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Goodra started making some headway into the format. Also Arcdura possibly as well, if Lugia becomes popular enough. And if Lugia is still like a top 3 deck, having Dura at your disposal is also like somewhat appealing. Those are just some of my knee-jerk reactions, really, to the format. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.